the power shift begins in Venezuela. Let me take you back to July 28, 2024, not the date itself, but what happened in the hours after midnight in Caracas. The National Electoral Council, Venezuela's official body, declared Nicolas Maduro the winner of the presidential election with 51% of the vote. The opposition, led by Edmundo Gonzalez, immediately cried fraud, claiming they had won by a landslide. The U.S. State Department, the OAS, and a chorus of Western media outlets echoed those claims within hours. By dawn, the narrative was another stolen election in a dictatorship clinging to power. But here's what they're not telling you. That night wasn't just about an election, it was the opening act of a geopolitical realignment that will shape the next decade. And if you think this is just another Latin American crisis, you're missing the bigger picture. I've spent the last 30 years studying power transitions, from the fall of the Soviet Union to the rise of China, and what's unfolding in Venezuela right now is the first major test of whether the United States can still enforce its will on the world or whether the era of unchallenged American hegemony is finally ending. Let me explain why this matters more than you've been led to believe. The official what they want you to believe. The story is simple, clean, and emotionally compelling. Maduro, a dictator who has driven his country into economic ruin, rigged another election to stay in power. The Venezuelan people, desperate for change, overwhelmingly supported the opposition, only to be denied their democratic right. The U.S., as the leader of the free world, has a moral obligation to stand with the Venezuelan people, impose sanctions, and if necessary, support a transition to democracy by force if required. That's the version you've heard from the White House, the State Department, and every major Western news outlet. The numbers seem to back it. Venezuela's GDP has collapsed by 75% since 2013, over 7 million people have fled the country, and hyperinflation has made the bolivar worthless. Maduro's government has jailed opponents, banned candidates, and used state resources to buy votes. The opposition, meanwhile, claims to have won 67% of the vote, based on exit polls and their own tally of voting records. The OAS, the EU, and even some Latin American governments have refused to recognize the results, calling for new elections. On the surface, it's a clear-cut case of authoritarianism versus democracy. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's incomplete, and in some ways, deliberately misleading. What's really happening in Venezuela? Let's start with the election itself. The opposition's claim of a 67% landslide is based on a quick count of voting receipts from 80% of polling stations. That sounds impressive until you realize that the remaining 20% were in rural and pro-government areas, where Maduro's support is strongest. The government, for its part, has refused to release the full voting records, citing cyber attacks and foreign interference. That's not exactly reassuring, but it's also not proof of fraud. Here's where it gets interesting. Independent observers from the Carter Center and the UN were present, and while they didn't endorse the results, they didn't declare the election fraudulent either. The Carter Center's report noted irregularities but stopped short of calling the vote illegitimate. The UN statement was similarly cautious. That's not the kind of language you'd expect if this were a blatant theft of an election. Then there's the opposition itself. Edmundo Gonzalez is a respected diplomat, but he's not the real leader of the opposition. That would be Maria Corina Machado, a hardline anti-Chavista who was banned from running. Machado has called for foreign intervention, including U.S. military action, to remove Maduro. She's also openly aligned with the most hawkish elements in Washington, including figures like Senator Marco Rubio and former Trump officials. That's not a neutral stance, it's a direct challenge to Venezuela's sovereignty. Now, let's talk about the U.S. role. The Biden administration has imposed new sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, targeting its ability to export crude. The goal, officially, is to pressure Maduro into holding free and fair elections. But here's the: sanctions have been in place for over a decade, and they haven't worked. If anything, they've strengthened Maduro's grip on power by giving him an external enemy to rally against. The real effect has been to push Venezuela deeper into the arms of Russia and China. And that's the key. Venezuela isn't just a domestic crisis, it's a geopolitical battleground. Maduro knows he can't survive without foreign backers, and he's playing the great powers off each other. Russia has sent military advisors and invested billions in Venezuela's oil sector. China has provided loans and diplomatic cover at the UN, and Iran has supplied drones and oil expertise. Meanwhile, the US has tried to isolate Venezuela, but its efforts have only accelerated Caracas's pivot toward Moscow and Beijing. So what's really happening? The election wasn't just about Maduro staying in power, it was about Venezuela positioning itself as a frontline state in the new Cold War. And the US response isn't just about democracy, it's about reasserting control over what Washington still sees as its backyard. The X did geopolitical Venezuela as the first domino. To understand why this matters, you have to out. The world is in the middle of a fundamental power shift. The unipolar moment, the period after the Cold War when the US was the sole superpower, is over. China is rising, Russia is resurgent, and the global South is increasingly asserting its independence. The question now is whether the US will accept a multipolar world or try to cling to its fading dominance. Venezuela is the first major test of this new era. Let's start with Russia. Moscow has been cultivating Venezuela for years, seeing it as a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Russian military advisors have been training Venezuelan forces, and Rosneft, Russia's state-owned oil company, has invested heavily in Venezuela's energy sector. In 2019, when the US recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, Russia sent troops to protect Maduro. That wasn't just about Venezuela, it was a message to you: don't get to decide who rules in our sphere of influence. China, meanwhile, has been playing the long game. Beijing has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion since 2007, most of it secured against future oil deliveries. That's not charity, it's a strategic investment. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, and China needs that oil to fuel its economy. But more importantly, China sees Venezuela as a partner in its broader effort to create an alternative to US dominance. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's global infrastructure project, includes Venezuela as a key node. And unlike the US, China doesn't lecture Maduro about democracy, it offers investment in trade. Then there's Iran. Tehran has been supplying Venezuela with oil expertise, drones, and even gasoline to bypass US sanctions. In return, Venezuela has become a critical ally for Iran, providing a base in the Western Hemisphere from which to project power. The two countries have also deepened their military cooperation, with Iranian advisors helping Venezuela develop its own drone program. That's not just about oil, it's about creating a network of anti-American states that can support each other in the face of US pressure. Now, let's talk about the US response. The Biden administration has framed its Venezuela policy as a defense of democracy, but the reality is more complicated. The US has a long history of intervening in Latin America, from the Bay of Pigs to the coup in Chile to the support for right-wing death squads in Central America. The Monroe Doctrine, the 19th-century policy that declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to European powers, is still the guiding principle of US policy in the region. And while the US no longer openly invades countries, it still uses economic coercion, covert operations, and diplomatic pressure to shape outcomes. The problem is that this approach is no longer working. The global South is pushing back. Countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, all US allies, have refused to recognize Guaidó and have called for dialogue with Maduro. Even the OAS, long a tool of US influence, is divided. The world is changing, and the US can't just snap its fingers and expect compliance anymore. That's the real significance of Venezuela. It's not just about one election, it's about whether the US can still enforce its will on the world. And the early signs suggest that it can't. Military and strategic: the risks of escalation. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. The US has a long history of military intervention in Latin America, and Venezuela is no exception. In 2019, the Trump administration came dangerously close to launching a military operation to remove Maduro. National Security Advisor John Bolton even wrote in his memoir that Trump asked, "Why can't we just invade?" The Pentagon reportedly drew up plans for a limited strike, but cooler heads prevailed, barely. The problem is that military intervention in Venezuela would be a disaster. Let's start with the Venezuela is not Grenada or AMA. It's a country of 28 million people with a standing army of 120,000, backed by Russian and Iranian advisors. The Venezuelan military has been preparing for a U.S. invasion for years, and it has the terrain to wage a protracted guerrilla war. The country is covered in dense jungles, mountains, and urban areas, perfect for insurgency. Then there's the Russian factor. Moscow has made it clear that it will defend Maduro. In 2019, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of force. More recently, it has deployed military advisors and supplied advanced air defense systems. If the U.S. were to launch a strike, it would risk a direct confrontation with Russia, a scenario that could quickly spiral out of control. And let's not forget China. Beijing has no interest in seeing Maduro fall, because it would mean losing access to Venezuela's oil. China has already warned the U.S. against military action, and it has the economic leverage to make life difficult for Washington. A U.S. invasion of Venezuela could trigger a broader crisis, with China retaliating in the South China Sea or Taiwan. The hawks in Washington who think this would be a quick and easy operation are delusional. Look at Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, all cases where the U.S. thought it could impose its will with minimal effort, only to get bogged down in endless wars. Venezuela would be no different. And the costs, human, financial, and geopolitical, would be enormous. The domestic political why this matters in Washington. Now, let's talk about the domestic politics of this crisis. The Biden administration's Venezuela policy isn't just about foreign policy, it's about domestic politics, too. Let's start with Florida. The state is home to over 1 million Venezuelan exiles, many of whom are fiercely anti-Maduro. They're a key voting bloc in a swing state that could decide the next presidential election. The Biden administration has been under pressure from Florida Democrats to take a harder line on Venezuela, and the recent sanctions are partly an attempt to win back support in the state. Then there's the broader Democratic base. Progressives have been critical of Biden's foreign policy, accusing him of continuing Trump's hawkish approach. But on Venezuela, the administration has faced pressure from the other side, from centrists and Republicans who want a more aggressive stance. The result is a policy that tries to please everyone but ends up satisfying no one. And let's not forget the role of key figures in the administration. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has been a leading voice for a more restrained approach, arguing that sanctions and diplomacy are the best way to deal with Maduro. But Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been more hawkish, pushing for a harder line. The tension between these two factions has led to a policy that is often inconsistent and reactive. The problem is that domestic politics are distorting foreign policy. The U.S. can't afford to treat Venezuela as a domestic political issue, it's a geopolitical crisis with real stakes. But that's exactly what's happening, and it's making it harder to craft a coherent strategy. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's look at the 3 most likely scenarios. Scenario 1, the best case. In this scenario, the U.S. and its allies accept the election results, but with conditions. Maduro agrees to hold new legislative elections within a year, with international observers and a more level playing field. The U.S. eases some sanctions in return, and Venezuela begins a slow process of economic and political reform. Russia and China accept this outcome, seeing it as the least bad option. This is the best-case scenario, but it's also the least likely. Maduro has no incentive to give up power, and the U.S. has no incentive to accept his victory. The opposition would see this as a betrayal, and hardliners in Washington would accuse the administration of appeasement. Still, it's not impossible if cooler heads prevail. Scenario 2, the most likely. In this scenario, the standoff continues. The U.S. and its allies refuse to recognize Maduro's victory, imposing new sanctions and supporting the opposition's efforts to challenge the results. Maduro, in turn, cracks down on dissent, arresting opposition leaders and tightening his grip on power. Russia and China double down on their support, providing economic and military assistance. Venezuela becomes a frozen conflict, like Ukraine or Taiwan, a perpetual crisis that neither side can resolve. This is the most likely outcome, because it's the path of least resistance. Neither side has an incentive to back down, and both have powerful allies. The result is a stalemate, with Venezuela caught in the middle. Scenario 3, the worst case. In this scenario, the crisis escalates into direct confrontation. The US and its allies declare Maduro's government illegitimate and recognize the opposition as the legitimate government. They impose a full embargo on Venezuelan oil, cutting off Maduro's main source of revenue. The opposition, emboldened by foreign support, launches mass protests and calls for a general strike. Maduro responds with a violent crackdown, leading to a full-blown civil war. Russia and China, seeing their interests threatened, increased their support for Maduro. Moscow sends more military advisors, and Beijing provides economic lifelines. The US, facing pressure from hawks in Congress, considers military action. The result is a proxy war, with Venezuela becoming the next Syria, a battleground for great power competition. This is the worst-case scenario, but it's not impossible. The US has a history of miscalculating in Latin America, and the stakes are higher than ever. If this happens, the consequences will be felt far beyond Venezuela. Grand strategy: the decline of American hegemony. Now, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. What's happening in Venezuela is a symptom of a larger the decline of American hegemony. For the past 30 years, the US has pursued a grand strategy of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US should use its power to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights around the world. The goal was to create a global order that reflected American values and interests. But that strategy has failed. Look at the results. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were disasters. The Arab Spring led to chaos, not democracy. The pivot to Asia has been overshadowed by crises in Europe and the Middle East. And now, the US is facing a world where its power is no longer unchallenged. The problem is that the US is trying to do too much with too little. It's still acting like the sole superpower, but the reality is that it's just one of several great powers. China is rising, Russia is resurgent, and the global South is asserting its independence. The US can't impose its will on the world anymore, it has to negotiate. That's the lesson of Venezuela. The US can't just snap its fingers and expect Maduro to fall. It has to deal with the world as it is, not as it wishes it to be. And that means accepting that Venezuela, like many other countries, will have to find its own path even if that path doesn't align with American interests. This isn't about appeasement, it's about realism. The US has to recognize that its power is limited, and that it can't solve every problem with military force or economic coercion. It has to work with other countries, even if they don't share its values. And it has to accept that the world is becoming multipolar, whether it likes it or not. Alternatives and what the US should do instead. So what should the US do? Here's my recommendation, controversial as it may disengage. That doesn't mean abandoning Venezuela, it means accepting that the US can't control the outcome. The first step is to lift the sanctions. They haven't worked, and they've only pushed Venezuela closer to Russia and China. The second step is to open a dialogue with Maduro, not as a reward for good behavior, but as a recognition of reality. The third step is to work with regional partners, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, to find a negotiated solution. This isn't about giving Maduro a free pass, it's about recognizing that the current approach isn't working. The US has to stop treating Venezuela as a domestic political issue and start treating it as a geopolitical challenge. That means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere, at least not in the short term, and that the best way to promote democracy is through engagement, not isolation. Now, I know what some of you are: this is surrender. This is appeasement. But let me be clear, this isn't about giving up. It's about being smart. The US has to pick its battles, and Venezuela isn't one of them. The real challenge is China, and the US can't afford to get bogged down in a quagmire in Latin America while Beijing is making inroads in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The alternative is to double down on the current approach, to keep imposing sanctions, supporting the opposition, and hoping for regime change. But that's a recipe for failure. It's time for a new strategy, one that recognizes the limits of American power and the need to prioritize where that power is spent. Because if we're honest with ourselves, Venezuela is no longer just a Latin American problem, it's a geopolitical chess piece in a much larger game, and the board is shifting beneath our feet. Now, what most people don't realize is that the military dimension of this crisis has been quietly escalating for years, and it's not just about Russian mercenaries or Chinese oil deals. The real story is how Venezuela has become a testing ground for hybrid warfare, where the lines between conventional conflict, economic sabotage, and information operations blur into something far more dangerous. Let me explain why this matters. Back in 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president with U.S. backing, the Trump administration wasn't just making a political statement, it was laying the groundwork for what many in Washington believed would be a rapid regime collapse. The plan, as later revealed in leaked documents and congressional testimony, involved a multi-pronged crippling sanctions, covert support for opposition groups, and even the possibility of a limited military intervention under the guise of humanitarian aid. Remember the standoff at the Colombian-Venezuelan border in February of that year? The U.S. flew in supplies, blocked by Maduro's forces, while Guaidó tried to rally the military to defect. It was a high-stakes gamble, and it failed spectacularly. But here's the uncomfortable: the failure wasn't just about Maduro's resilience. It was about the fact that Venezuela had already become a forward operating base for powers that see the U.S. as their primary adversary. Take Russia's involvement. In March 2019, just weeks after Guaidó's gambit, 2 Russian military planes landed in Caracas carrying nearly 100 troops and 35 tons of equipment. The official story was that they were there to service Russian-made military hardware, Venezuela's aging Sukhoi jets and S-300 air defense systems. But the timing was no coincidence. Moscow wasn't just protecting its arms contracts, it was sending a message. A few months later, in December, Russia deployed 2 Tu-160 strategic bombers to Venezuela, capable of carrying nuclear weapons. The bombers didn't stay long, but the symbolism was if the U.S. pushed too hard, Russia could turn Venezuela into a thorn in Washington's side, just as it had done with Syria. Then there's China. Beijing's interest in Venezuela isn't just about oil, it's about securing a foothold in America's backyard. Since 2007, China has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion, much of it collateralized against oil shipments. But in recent years, those loans have come with strings attached: military and technological cooperation. In 2021, Venezuela became the first Latin American country to purchase Chinese-made Wing-Long 2 drones, a move that raised eyebrows in the Pentagon. These aren't just surveillance tools, they're armed platforms that could be used for targeted strikes. And in 2023, reports emerged that China was helping Venezuela modernize its military communications infrastructure, including the installation of a new satellite ground station. Why does that matter? Because it gives Beijing a potential backdoor into regional military networks, something that could complicate U.S. operations in the Caribbean or the South Atlantic. Now, let's talk about Iran. The Islamic Republic's relationship with Venezuela has deepened dramatically in the past 5 years, and it's not just about circumventing U.S. sanctions. In 2020, Iran sent 5 tankers to Venezuela carrying gasoline and refining equipment, a lifeline for Maduro's regime. But the real concern is the military and intelligence cooperation. In 2022, the U.S. seized a shipment of Iranian-made missiles bound for Venezuela, including precision-guided munitions. And in 2023, reports surfaced that Iran's Quds Force, its elite foreign operations unit, was training Venezuelan special forces in asymmetric warfare tactics. This isn't just about propping up Maduro, it's about creating a network of anti-U.S. proxies in the Western Hemisphere, mirroring Iran's playbook in the Middle East. Here's where it gets even more complicated. Venezuela's military isn't just a client of these foreign powers, it's becoming an integrated part of their strategic calculations. The Russian private military Komi Wagner Group, for instance, has been operating in Venezuela since at least 2019, providing security for Maduro and training elite units like the FAES, Venezuela's notorious special forces. But Wagner's role isn't just about regime protection. It's about creating a deniable military presence that can be activated if tensions escalate. And with Wagner's recent rebranding under the Kremlin's direct control, that presence is only going to grow. The Chinese, meanwhile, have been quietly extending their influence within Venezuela's military-industrial complex. In 2022, Venezuela and China signed a defense cooperation agreement that included joint production of military equipment. This isn't just about selling weapons, it's about embedding Chinese technology into Venezuela's defense infrastructure, creating dependencies that will last for decades. And let's not forget the cyber dimension. In 2021, Microsoft reported that a Chinese state-linked hacking group had targeted Venezuela's military and energy sectors, likely to gather intelligence and map out potential vulnerabilities. So what does all this mean for the US? It means that Venezuela is no longer just a failed state or a humanitarian disaster, it's a potential flashpoint in a global competition. The risk isn't just that Maduro stays in power, it's that Venezuela becomes a hub for anti-US military and intelligence operations, a place where Russia, China, and Iran can project power without having to deploy large numbers of their own troops. And that's a scenario the Pentagon is increasingly worried about. Let me give you an example. In 2022, the U.S. Southern Command, which oversees military operations in Latin America, released its annual posture statement. For the first time, it listed China and Russia as near-peer competitors in the region, warning that their activities in Venezuela and elsewhere posed a direct threat to U.S. security. The statement didn't just talk about economic influence, it highlighted the risk of military and intelligence cooperation that could undermine U.S. operations in the Caribbean and the South Atlantic. That's not hyperbole. If you look at a map, Venezuela sits at the northern tip of South America, just a few hundred miles from the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. It's a strategic choke point, and if it falls into the wrong hands, it could disrupt U.S. naval and air operations in the region. Now, I know what some of you are. This is alarmist. Venezuela is a mess, but it's not a military threat to the U.S. And you're right, Venezuela on its own isn't a threat. But Venezuela as a proxy for Russia, China, and Iran? That's a different story. And that's the scenario we're sleepwalking into if we don't change course. So what should the US do about the military dimension? First, it needs to stop treating Venezuela as a binary problem, either Maduro goes or the US doubles down on regime change. That mindset is what got us into this mess in the first place. Instead, the US should focus on containment. That means working with regional partners to monitor and counter foreign military presence in Venezuela, without escalating into direct confrontation. It means using intelligence and diplomatic channels to disrupt the most destabilizing aspects of Russian, Chinese, and Iranian involvement, while avoiding actions that could provoke a wider conflict. Second, the US needs to rethink its military posture in the region. For too long, Southern Command has been treated as a backwater, a place where officers go to get a few easy deployments before moving on to more important theaters. That's a mistake. The U.S. needs to invest in its regional alliances, particularly with Colombia and Brazil, to create a counterbalance to foreign influence in Venezuela. It needs to modernize its bases in the Caribbean and Central America, not just for counter-narcotics operations, but for rapid response in case of a crisis. And it needs to work with NATO allies to develop a coordinated strategy for dealing with Russian and Chinese military activities in the Western Hemisphere. Third, the U.S. has to accept that military solutions alone won't fix Venezuela. The real battle isn't on the battlefield, it's in the realm of information, economics, and diplomacy. The U.S. needs to counter the narrative that it's the sole cause of Venezuela's problems, while also exposing the predatory nature of Russian, Chinese, and Iranian involvement. That means working with independent media, civil society groups, and even disillusioned members of the Venezuelan military to undermine the regime's legitimacy from within. But here's the hard: none of this will work if the US keeps treating Venezuela as a domestic political football. The sanctions, the regime change rhetoric, the moralizing, it's all part of a script that's been playing on repeat for over a decade, and it's not getting us anywhere. The world has changed, and the US needs to change with it. That means accepting that Venezuela is no longer a problem to be solved, but a reality to be managed. It means recognizing that the real threat isn't Maduro, it's the geopolitical vacuum that's being filled by America's adversaries. And that brings me to the final point: the power shift in Venezuela isn't just about who controls Caracas, it's about what kind of world we're living in. The unipolar moment is over, and the US can't afford to keep fighting yesterday's battles. If we're serious about countering China and Russia, we need to stop wasting resources on unwinnable conflicts in our own backyard. We need to focus on the places where our power can make a real difference: Taiwan, the South China Sea, Eastern Europe, and stop pretending that we can micromanage every crisis on the planet. Venezuela is a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that power is fluid, that alliances shift, and that the cost of overreach can be devastating. The question now is whether the US will learn from its mistakes, or whether it will keep doubling down on a strategy that's already failed. The choice is ours, but time is running out. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader collapse of the post-Cold War order. The establishment in Washington still operates under the assumption that the US can dictate outcomes in its near abroad, as if it were 1999 and the Monroe Doctrine still carried the weight of divine right. But the world has moved on. The sanctions regime against Venezuela, which began in earnest under Obama in 2015 and escalated under Trump, was supposed to be a surgical tool to force regime change. Instead, it became a blunt instrument that deepened Caracas's dependence on Moscow and Beijing. By 2023, China had become Venezuela's largest creditor, with over $60 billion in loans secured by oil, loans that Maduro has no intention of repaying in full, because he knows Beijing's real interest isn't the money, but the leverage. Meanwhile, Russia's Wagner Group has embedded itself in Venezuela's gold mines, and Iranian drones are now a fixture in the country's military exercises. This isn't containment, it's strategic encirclement. Let me explain why this matters beyond the usual talking points. The US foreign policy blob still clings to the idea that sanctions are a form of moral pressure, a way to punish bad actors without firing a shot. But in Venezuela, sanctions have become a geopolitical accelerant. They've forced Maduro to diversify his alliances, not weaken his grip. The 2019 oil embargo, for instance, didn't collapse the regime, it pushed Venezuela into the arms of Rosneft, which stepped in to buy and resell Venezuelan crude at a discount, effectively laundering it through Russian and Indian refineries. By 2021, even as US officials were crowing about the maximum pressure campaign, Venezuela's oil exports had rebounded to nearly 800,000 barrels per day, thanks to these shadow networks. The sanctions didn't starve the regime, they just made it more creative. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no coherent grand strategy for Venezuela because it's still trapped in a 20th century mindset. The options on the table, more sanctions, more isolation, more regime change rhetoric, are all variations of the same failed approach. What's missing is a recognition that Venezuela is no longer a client state to be disciplined, but a sovereign actor with its own agency, however diminished. The question isn't how to force Maduro out, it's how to manage the reality of his rule while mitigating the damage to US interests. So what are the alternatives? The first is a hard pivot toward engagement, not with Maduro himself, but with the institutions and actors that still have some independence from the regime. That means working with the opposition in a way that doesn't just treat them as pawns in a US power play. The 2024 elections were a farce, but they also showed that the opposition can still mobilize millions of voters. The US should be supporting those efforts, not just with moralizing statements, but with concrete resources, funding for independent media, legal aid for political prisoners, and economic incentives for local governments that resist the regime's control. The goal isn't to overthrow Maduro, but to create pockets of resistance that can erode his authority over time. The second alternative is a rethink of sanctions. The current approach is like trying to put out a fire by throwing gasoline on it. Instead of broad-based economic warfare, the US should target specific sectors where it can actually exert leverage, like Venezuela's gold trade, which is now dominated by Russian and Turkish middlemen. The 2020 sanctions on Venezuela's state gold Comi, Minerven, were a step in the right direction, but they were too little, too late. A more aggressive approach would involve secondary sanctions on any entity, Russian, Chinese, or otherwise, that facilitates the regime's gold exports. The same goes for Venezuela's cryptocurrency schemes, which have become a lifeline for the regime. The US has the tools to disrupt these networks, it just needs the political will to use them. The third alternative is the most: a limited détente with the regime. I'm not talking about normalization, but a transactional relationship that serves US interests. The Biden administration's 2023 deal with Maduro, swapping sanctions relief for the release of American prisoners and a promise of free elections, was a rare moment of pragmatism. It didn't last, because both sides reverted to Maduro rigged the elections, and the US reimposed sanctions. But the episode showed that even a pariah regime can be negotiated with when the incentives are right. The US should be exploring more of these deals, not as a favor to Maduro, but as a way to peel Venezuela away from its adversaries. For instance, offering sanctions relief in exchange for a phased withdrawal of Russian and Iranian military advisors would be a low-cost way to reduce the regime's dependence on its patrons. Now, I can already hear the "but Maduro is a dictator. We can't reward him." To which we've been trying to punish him for 20 years, and it hasn't worked. The moral high ground is cold comfort when the alternative is a Venezuela that's effectively a Russian-Iranian forward operating base in the Western Hemisphere. The US has to ask itself what's more, maintaining the illusion of moral purity, or protecting its strategic interests? The answer should be obvious. The final piece of this puzzle is the regional dimension. The US can't manage Venezuela alone, because the crisis has already spilled over into Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. The 2023 migration surge: over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. The largest displacement crisis in the Americas has overwhelmed neighboring states. Colombia alone has taken in nearly 3 million refugees, and its president, Gustavo Petro, has been vocal about the need for a new approach. The US should be working with regional partners to create a coordinated response, not just on migration, but on security and economic stabilization. That means reviving the Lima Group, which collapsed after most of its members recognized Maduro's 2018 re-election, and finding common ground with Brazil's Lula, who has oscillated between condemning Maduro and calling for dialogue. But here's the: none of this will work if the US keeps treating Latin America as a subordinate region rather than a collection of sovereign states with their own interests. The Monroe Doctrine is dead, but its ghost still haunts Washington. The US needs to accept that it can't dictate outcomes in its own backyard anymore. What it can do is compete by offering better alternatives to Chinese loans, Russian arms, and Iranian influence. That means investing in regional infrastructure, supporting democratic institutions, and, yes, engaging with governments that don't always align with US preferences. It's not about abandoning principles, it's about recognizing that principles without power are just empty rhetoric. So where does that leave us? Venezuela is a test case for a larger: can the US adapt to a world where its dominance is no longer guaranteed? The answer will determine whether Washington remains a relevant global actor, or whether it becomes a bystander to its own decline. The power shift in Venezuela isn't just about Maduro's survival, it's about whether the US can learn to play a different game. I'll leave you with this thought. In 1961, the US backed the Bay of Pigs invasion, a disastrous attempt to overthrow Castro that ended in humiliation. 60 years later, Cuba is still a thorn in America's side, and the US is still paying the price for its overreach. Venezuela is the Bay of Pigs of our time, a cautionary tale about the dangers of misplaced confidence and the cost of strategic myopia. The difference is that this time, the stakes are even higher. Because this isn't just about one country. It's about the future of American power in a world that's no longer willing to take its orders. The question is whether we'll learn the lesson, or whether we'll keep repeating the same mistakes until it's too late.